Muammar Gaddafi. Muammar Gaddafi spent his final hours hiding in a drainage pipe like a rat. After 42 years ruling Libya with an iron fist, NATO airstrikes and a rebel uprising destroyed everything. The man who had spent weeks calling rebels rats from his palace was now fleeing in disguise, abandoning his loyalists. On October 20th, 2011, his convoy was obliterated on a highway near Sirte. Gaddafi survived the strike and crawled into a concrete drainage culvert, bleeding and begging for mercy. Rebels dragged him out. They found him still clutching his golden pistol. It did not help. What followed was caught on dozens of phones. He was beaten and shot in the chaos. His body was displayed in a meat locker for 4 days before burial. He was 69 years old. Nicolae Ceausescu. Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu spent Christmas Day, 1989, facing a firing squad, and it was all caught on camera. After ruling Romania for 2 decades, building palaces while their people starved, the Ceausescus watched their power evaporate during the revolution. On December 22nd, they fled Bucharest by helicopter as protests overwhelmed the capital. They were captured within hours. 3 days later, on Christmas morning, they stood trial in a small room at a military base. The proceeding lasted barely 90 minutes. Charges included genocide and embezzlement. Nicolae appeared defiant. Elena screamed that the trial was illegal. The verdict was a death sentence. Minutes after the trial ended, soldiers led them to a courtyard. Nicolae began singing a communist anthem. Elena shouted at the soldiers, calling them traitors. The firing squad did not wait. They opened fire immediately, and over 100 bullets tore into the elderly couple. Both died instantly against a concrete wall. That evening, Romanian television broadcast footage of their bodies to prove the dictators were dead. A brutal end on Christmas Day. They were 71 and 73 years old. Benito Mussolini. Benito Mussolini spent his final hours disguised as a German soldier, desperately fleeing toward Switzerland. By April 1945, Italy had collapsed. On April 27, communist partisans stopped a convoy near Lake Como. Hidden among German troops wearing a German coat, they found their leader. Mussolini and his mistress Clara Petacci were pulled from the convoy and held overnight. The next day, April 28, partisan commander Walter Audisio arrived with orders to execute them. Around 4 p.m., they were taken to the village of Giulino di Mezzagra and positioned against a stone wall. Audisio fired with a submachine gun. Both fell dead, bodies riddled with bullets. But it did not end there. Their corpses were driven to Milan's Piazzale Loreto, the same place where Mussolini's regime had displayed executed partisans months earlier. Crowds gathered and turned savage. The bodies were kicked, spat on, shot again. One woman emptied her pistol into Mussolini's corpse, once for each of her 5 dead sons. Then the bodies were hung upside down from a gas station roof. Mussolini dangled by his feet as crowds cheered. He was 61 years old. Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein's execution was supposed to be dignified. Instead, it turned into chaos caught on cell phones. After the U.S. invasion toppled his regime, Saddam spent 3 years facing trial for crimes against humanity. In November 2006, he was sentenced to death by hanging. At dawn on December 30th, 2006, the 69-year-old was led into an execution chamber at a Baghdad military base. A noose hung around his neck. Guards began taunting him. Sectarian insults echoed through the room. Saddam remained calm, reciting prayers. Someone was filming everything. His final words were defiant. Then the trapdoor opened. He dropped. His neck broke cleanly. It was over in seconds. Within hours, the footage leaked online and spread worldwide. Saddam was gone. He was 69 years old. Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin might have been destroyed by his own terror. On March 1st, 1953, Stalin hosted a late-night dinner at his dacha, drinking heavily with officials who feared execution. Around 4 a.m., he dismissed everyone and went to bed. Then, silence. Hours passed. Stalin always called for his guards by noon. March 2nd came and went with nothing. His guards knew something was wrong, but they were too terrified to check without being summoned. Finally, nearly 16 hours later, someone looked inside. They found the 74-year-old dictator lying on the floor, partially paralyzed from a massive stroke. Doctors were called, but the damage was deadly. Stalin lingered for 3 more days, unable to speak, slowly dying. On March 5, 1953, at 9:50 p.m., he died. Public mourning swept the Soviet Union, but privately, millions felt relief. He was 74 years old. Hideki Tojo. Hideki Tojo tried to kill himself when American soldiers came for him, and he failed. As Japan's wartime prime minister, Tojo had overseen brutal campaigns that killed millions. On September 11, 1945, American military police surrounded his Tokyo home. As officers closed in, Tojo retreated to a back room and fired a pistol into his chest, aiming for his heart. He missed. Soldiers burst through the door and found him bleeding, but alive. American medics saved his life. The irony was brutal. The nation he attacked kept him alive for trial. 3 years later, he was found guilty of war crimes. On December 23, 1948, just after midnight, he was led to the gallows at Sugamo prison. The floor dropped. His neck snapped. He was 64 years old. Pol Pot died peacefully in his sleep. And that may be history's greatest injustice. Between 1975 and 1979, nearly 2 million people died under his rule. When his regime collapsed, he fled into the jungle and lived as a fugitive for 2 decades. By April 1998, his former comrades had placed the 73-year-old under house arrest. International tribunals demanded his surrender. On the night of April 15, 1998, Pol Pot died in his sleep in a bamboo hut. Official cause, heart failure. The timing, convenient. His body was displayed to journalists, photographed on a filthy mattress. The next day, he was burned on a funeral pyre made of old tires and garbage. No trial, no justice. He was 73 years old. Adolf Hitler. By late April 1945, Soviet artillery was tearing Berlin apart, and Adolf Hitler knew the Third Reich was finished. For 12 years, he had sent millions to death camps and battlefields. Now he was trapped in a bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. On April 29, 1945, he married Eva Braun in a midnight ceremony. On April 30th, around 3:30 p.m., they withdrew into a private room. Hitler bit into a cyanide capsule and shot himself in the right temple. Eva took poison. Their bodies were carried outside, doused in fuel, and set on fire as Soviet shells fell. That is the official story, but here it turns murky. The Soviets recovered charred remains. Stories changed. Burial sites shifted. In 1970, the KGB claimed they destroyed what was left. No verification, no witnesses. For decades, rumors spread about escapes to Argentina. Most historians dismiss it, but uncertainty lingered. He was 56 years old. Francisco Franco. Francisco Franco ruled Spain for 36 years, and unlike most tyrants, he died in bed while doctors fought to keep him alive. By 1975, the 82-year-old was failing. On October 15, 1975, he suffered a massive heart attack. Over the next 5 weeks, he endured multiple heart attacks, internal bleeding, and kidney failure. Doctors performed emergency surgeries, even removing most of his stomach. His body shut down, system by system. Finally, on November 20, 1975, at 5:25 a.m., Franco died at La Paz Hospital in Madrid. He was embalmed and buried in the Valley of the Fallen. Decades later, Spain exhumed and moved his remains. Unlike most tyrants, Franco died of old age, ruling until his final breath. He was 82 years old.